Next, we have Jordan Fielders, who's with the Hydrogen Energy California, and I know we were talking, maybe you can talk a little more about that name. I know personally, I think this is one project that seems to be a little bit under the radar. As I got to understand it a little bit better, it's a JV between BP and Rio Tinto to do a gasification project and use the CO2, capture the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Jordan's with Rio Tinto, so you can save all your BP questions for someone else. Jordan?
Sure, this is on. Thanks for having us here. So Hydrogen Energy California is a joint venture, 50-50 between, I guess, as you've heard, two major international energy and natural resource companies. We're working to permit and with the ambition to build, starting in January 2012, a medium-sized 250 megawatt solid fuels to hydrogen power plant that would capture 90% of its greenhouse gas emissions. So it would be a power plant that transforms solid fossil fuels into hydrogen and has an integrated process of 90% carbon capture storage. Ultimate objective is to create technologies that enable solid fossil fuels to be used in a low carbon regulatory environment in an economic manner. Some of the interesting aspects of this project is that the captured CO2 is being reinjected about 6,000 feet underground. And I say reinjected because it's ultimately being put back where it came from, over a mile underground into former oil reservoirs that are sealed with geological cap rocks underground that keep the CO2 in place for perpetuity, but also enables the enhanced recovery of trapped oil in California. So you have a win-win situation where there's near zero carbon electricity generated and additional in-state oil production.
Real quick, Jordan, maybe if you could talk for a second about, obviously Rio Tinto, the feed, the fuel for this, and I think why BP and Rio Tinto have so much interest in a project like this.
Yeah, the predominant fuel that'll be used is petcoke, which is the remaining material out of the refining process, which is a solid. When you take a barrel of oil and turn it into gasoline, the solid residue of that is a coal-like substance called petcoke. It's generally exported overseas and used in power markets in developing countries. So instead of exporting what is a residual of the oil refining process, we're keeping it in California and transforming it through a very clean process into a near zero carbon and also criteria pollutant emission source of energy. There would also be a mix of Western coal that would be used, and the target is to create electricity using solid fossil fuels with a factor of 3 times less greenhouse gas emissions than natural gas, for example. So you're talking 20 times less greenhouse gas emissions than a traditional coal plant, and taking a residual element that exists in California refineries that's exported overseas and doing something responsible with it in California.
Great, thanks. In rounding up the discussion, I thought it would be good to end with a slightly different perspective here. We have Stephen Cuevas from Arriva, who some of you may know is probably the world's largest renewable energy, probably producer of electricity, I would imagine, or Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but as well as one of the largest nuclear power producers in the world, been extremely aggressive in the renewable space. Again, we may view nuclear as traditional energy, so they've been doing renewables to supplement that, I believe, but it's a huge push for them. and have been very active in some acquisitions as well recently, which I think are very interesting. Steve?
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm a West Coast guy, born and raised, and I live on the East Coast now, so any opportunity I have to come back and enjoy the great weather on the West Coast, I take advantage of. I wouldn't go so far to say we're the largest renewable power company in the world. I'm adventurous to say we're one of the largest biomass companies in the world. We have about 114 plants we've built worldwide. The U.S., starting in about 2000, we were largely looking at the U.S. up until that point as a export market. And then reviewing that strategy, we realized that being the largest energy consumer in the world, that it really needed to be a base operation, and itself being the base operation for export. And so we've made major investments in the U.S. on the nuclear side, which I won't go into in too much detail, in terms of building a $500 million heavy forging facility in Newport News with a joint venture with Northrop Grumman. And as Steve Spinner said earlier, we just received the loan guarantee for our Eagle Rock plant, which is a uranium enrichment facility. It's going to be in Idaho Falls, Idaho. But where I work is the company's decided to diversify its portfolio worldwide in the renewable space and really focus on being the largest carbon or CO2-free or CO2-neutral power generation technology company in the world. And to that end, we acquired a company in Germany in the offshore wind market called Multibrid, just announced last week or earlier this week, whatever day it is today, that we have acquired the remaining percentage of that company. It's a 5 megawatt built from scratch offshore wind production. We were the first turbines in the water in the North Sea of Germany. A month ago or so, we finally closed on our solar company out of California, which will be our base operations for our worldwide offering for solar. It's a CSP company called OSRA out of Mountain View, California, with manufacturing in Arizona. So if Chevron needs some help in manufacturing for those steam powered, we should talk. Get some business out of this trip. And then we are slowly moving into the offshore market in the U.S., which is a little bit slow to play, and probably going to be a little bit slower now that MMS has other issues apparently on their plate that they have to deal with. But in the last issue we are moving into is storage, because from a strategic standpoint, the technologies are great, but as many of the panelists have talked about before, the wind blows when it blows, the sun shines when it shines. You have issues in terms of getting the power effectively into the grid and having that power available when needed. So the combination of storage and renewable generation together will help provide the grid parity, because that's the big issue we have in renewables, is the fact with worldwide natural gas prices dropping like they are, and as Amy pointed out, the way companies are going green is they're going to natural gas, not going to wind or solar, which is far more expensive, between the 10 cents to 19 cents a kilowatt price range, where coal and natural gas is 4 to 6. So our whole strategy is to focus on, initially on greening traditional power plants, doing cogeneration, doing booster plants. That's, I think, the baby steps into the market to help traditional power companies and utilities who have aging coal plants or aging other fossil type plants that want to maintain their output but lower their carbon emissions. We're also pursuing what we call our we picked up an initiative out of the DOE called the Clean Energy Park, trying to reuse some of their former nuclear sites in terms of building a nuclear power plant in connection with a solar plant or a biomass plant together, and then having sort of the universities engaged and having a whole sort of technology park around this, not just a generation of one facility. We would like to build an industry and not simply build a plant and walk away. We want to have a sustainable platform. So we're looking at the renewable platform in the worldwide and North America as the future. We don't think it's going to replace fossil. We think it needs to be a balance. Touching on what the last panel talked about in terms of the subsidies and the money, the stimulus going away. That is true, and that's going to hurt the solar market, which is getting quite a bit of subsidies, the ITCs, the PTC tax incentives, those things. But to us, I think the big issue is Okay, so you're not going to have the government spend money subsidizing. The other way we can look at this is a national energy policy, which includes a national RPS or RES standard, which, when you look at the polling, everyone wants renewable power. Then you say, well, how much are you willing to pay for it? And that's when people take a step back and say, well, it can't really raise rates now. It's a recession or what have you. So, without a sort of a federal impetus to the utilities that say you have to have a certain percentage blended in that will be of a higher rate, which will give us the time to develop these markets and these economies of scale to bring down the prices. I mean, just already you've had wind and solar, over the last 20 years has decreased quite a bit. So, that's kind of where we are in terms of strategy. We're early in the North American market, but we're active internationally. And a lot of people don't know how big our company is, 65,000 people worldwide. Or we pale in comparison to Chevron's revenue numbers, but we have about 6,000 employees in the U.S. So we think we have the infrastructure and then the leadership to be a main player on the renewable and traditional nuclear marketplace. So.
Great, thanks.